I can still remember the sound of our laughter echoing through the empty streets as kids. We were inseparable then, three best friends who swore to be there for each other forever. Life was simple, full of stickball games, daring adventures, and endless dreams of the future. As we grew, our paths began to diverge, but the bond we shared remained unbreakable, or so I thought. By the time we entered adulthood, the challenges of life began to chip away at that bond. Careers, relationships, and the ever-expanding distance between us all played a part. Yet no matter how much time passed, I always felt we'd find a way back to those carefree days. I never imagined that the very bond we once cherished would lead me to one of the darkest moments of my life. Today, my wife gave birth to a child, and my marriage came to an end. I'm almost certain it's over, though I'll get the final answer in a few hours. Usually, it takes longer, but the hospital is expediting the DNA test due to the circumstances. Honestly, I don't expect it to change anything. My phone keeps lighting up on the table as I sit in a bar just a few minutes from the hospital. I glance at it every so often, though I know the doctor won't be calling for at least a few more hours. The calls I'm ignoring are from my wife, my kids, and my in-laws. I can imagine they're all desperate to know what's going on. To be honest, so am I. The baby is absolutely gorgeous with golden curls that match her mother's. She's 7 pounds, 12 ounces, and 19 inches long. A perfect, healthy, full-term baby. But according to my wife, she was born at least 6 weeks premature. I may not be a medical expert, but I'm certainly not a fool. A baby born that early wouldn't be in such perfect condition, with such healthy skin and development. My wife has deceived me, and now, seeing things without the blinders of unconditional love, I realize my worst fear. This child is not mine. She's the daughter of my deceased best friend. The waitress sets down my 5th shot of Jack Daniels. At this rate, I'll have spent $150 on a bottle that retails for $25. Frankly, I don't care. I slip back into my haze. The Three Amigos feels like it happened in another lifetime, especially for Gary. We had been inseparable since we were about 5, after our families moved onto the same street within a 2-year span. Gary and I moved in the same summer, and Tracy followed the next spring. By then, Gary and I were already thick as thieves, and Tracy fit right in. Back then, she was a complete tomboy, faster than me, stronger than Gary, and always right there with us for every game. While other girls played with dolls, Tracy was out with us, playing kickball or stickball with the boys, holding her own without breaking a sweat. Things started to change when we hit our teenage years. Tracy, in particular, underwent a physical transformation. She went from being a slim, blonde girl with long braids to a young woman with curves, a fuller figure, and glossy hair. Both Gary and I noticed the changes, but neither of us dared to say anything, knowing full well that Tracy could knock us both out without breaking a sweat. A year had passed, and while Gary and I were still as close as ever, there were moments when his absence wasn't the worst thing. Tracy and I seemed to grow even closer during those times, in ways both emotional and physical. One Sunday afternoon that summer, when Gary was off with his family, Tracy and I were sitting alone on my porch swing, and I got my first kiss. I couldn't even tell you what we were talking about. It was like everything faded away for a moment. Without warning, she leaned in and kissed me. Her lips were soft and sweet, tasting faintly of strawberry chapstick, and I felt my mind go completely blank, like static on a TV screen. "Wow," I whispered, unable to say anything else. Tracy blushed as we locked eyes. I took her hand and we sat there rocking together in silence. The next day, Gary was back, and if I hadn't been there for that kiss, I might have convinced myself it never happened. Tracy was acting like her usual self, as though nothing had changed. At one point, I reached out to take her hand, but she calmly pulled it away. I was confused and didn't know what to think. When the Christmas dance approached that year, I thought it was the perfect time to ask Tracy out. As we walked home from school one day, with Gary and Tracy flanking me, I gathered my courage and blurted out, "Hey, Trace, if you're free next month, do you want to go to the Christmas dance with me?" Tracy stopped in her tracks, causing both Gary and me to halt as well. Gary was smirking, and I could feel the tension in the air. I'm already going with Gary," she said, her voice faltering a little. "He asked me yesterday, Bobby." Gary smiled smugly, and Tracy looked embarrassed. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "Sorry, Bobby. You snooze, you lose," Gary teased. I felt two things at once, humiliated and blindsided. First, I had no clue Gary even had feelings for Tracy. And second, I knew the unspoken rule. Guys don't go after their friend's girl, even if I was just finding out about them. "Hey, Gar, I didn't know. No hard feelings, all right?" I said, trying to keep things cool. "I get it, Bobby," Gary replied. "All good." The rest of the walk home was awkward. Gary and Tracy talked casually while I stayed silent, feeling like an outsider. I didn't ask anyone else to the dance, and I sure didn't go alone. Yes, I felt betrayed, and yes, it stung coming from both my best friends. Later that night, my dad noticed my mood. He and my mom were in the living room, and I was in my room, sulking with my CD player on. A soft knock on my door broke my thoughts, and my dad poked his head inside. "Girls, huh?" he said, sitting in my desk chair. "Can't live with them, but you can't liquidate them either." I rolled my eyes, trying to shake off the funk. He shot me that familiar crooked grin. "Thanks, Dad. Really helpful," I replied dryly. After the dance, the dynamic between the three of us shifted. What had been the three amigos was now reduced to two amigos and their friend. Tracy and Gary were officially a couple, and they stayed that way throughout high school. I eventually dated other girls. By the time college came around, Tracy, Gary, and I went our separate ways. Tracy went to Michigan State, Gary to UCLA, and I ended up at Michigan State too. But because of the guy code, I kept my distance from Tracy. I didn't want anyone thinking I was trying to get involved with her after she and Gary broke up, even though she seemed confused by my coldness. One day, Tracy's mom, Mrs. Ford, pulled me aside and asked if something was wrong between Tracy and me. The Ford family had always treated me like one of their own, and I had a deep respect for them. Mrs. Ford told me that Tracy missed the way things had been before, but I knew that things had changed. We weren't kids anymore, and if Tracy wasn't with me, I couldn't think of anyone better for her than Gary. Things stayed quiet on that front until our junior year. Tracy unexpectedly asked me to be her date for her sorority's formal. I was taken aback, but I also didn't want to overstep, especially considering her recent breakup with Gary. When I asked her about it, she explained that she and Gary had broken up after the summer. Gary was moving to California to attend law school, and he didn't want to hold Tracy back from her own future. I was shocked to hear about Gary's law school plans, something I never would have expected from him. Still, Tracy and I went on our first date, which felt a little awkward at first. But by the second date, we shared a kiss. By the fourth, we had intimacy. It was clear that she had previous experience, but if it didn't matter to her, it didn't matter to me either. We continued dating for the next 2 years and eventually got married. Despite some initial discomfort, I asked Gary to be my best man at the wedding. Having him stand beside me, considering he had once been with the woman I was marrying, felt strange and definitely wasn't the most typical situation, but it was something I knew I had to do. Gary returned to California right after the wedding, and for over 2 decades, I didn't think about him much at all. 2 years into our marriage, our daughter Kaylee was born, followed by our son Jeffrey, another 2 years later. Life settled into a familiar rhythm, until one day my mom told me that Gary was coming back to town for a rare visit. Our parents all still lived on the same block, and Gary's mom had told mine that Gary was coming home to say goodbye. He had been diagnosed with cancer and had been given less than a year to live. He wanted to see his parents while he was still physically strong enough to do so. My mom reached out to Gary's mom and suggested organizing a gathering so he could visit old friends and family. She agreed. Gary was in the early stages of treatment when we saw him. He looked okay at first, but the weight of his situation was clear, and he seemed utterly defeated. He had been through 2 divorces and had no children. Tracy and I spent hours with him, catching up and talking about life, his life in particular, and how it was coming to a close. As the night wore on, Tracy suggested something that would eventually change everything. She proposed that we go out to California to help care for him until he needed hospice care. Both Gary and I were taken aback by the suggestion. It hadn't been discussed beforehand, and I wasn't sure how it would even work logistically. Tracy insisted, saying that Gary was our oldest friend and it felt like the right thing to do. Gary hesitated, pointing out that his doctors had said he still had a few months left before hospice would be necessary. He reminded us that we had 2 kids in college and couldn't just drop everything to take care of him. Tracy, however, had an idea. She worked for a company that was generous with family leave, and I could take some time off as well, using vacation and personal days. I wasn't sure it would be enough, but Tracy seemed determined. The more she talked, the more I felt uncomfortable. She was volunteering to spend months away from me and our home to care for Gary, and she was doing it right in front of him. I knew if I disagreed, I would look like the bad guy. Still, I hesitated, unsure about the commitment. Tracy's decision was made, and she dismissed my concerns. That settled then. she declared, leaving me to swallow my doubts. That night, I couldn't hold back my frustration. I confronted Tracy, furious that she was willing to abandon me for months to take care of Gary, of all people. She lashed back, accusing me of being selfish and unable to let go of the fact that Gary and she had once been involved. We fought fiercely, and I ended up spending the night in Jeffrey's old bedroom. It took us a few days to come to an agreement, but in the end, Tracy got her way. We arranged for Gary's care as she had promised, and he was deeply grateful. I felt guilty at first, but after the first month of juggling work, home life, and helping Tracy with Gary, I began to feel the weight of it all. By the second month, something felt off between Tracy and me. She was clearly exhausted, but I could tell she was also getting closer to Gary in a way that made me uneasy. There were moments when I caught the two of them exchanging subtle looks, like they shared a private language. I tried to dismiss it as a byproduct of stress, but it didn't sit right with me. The next couple of months seemed to push our relationship further apart. I started to feel like I was intruding on their time together, and Tracy's demeanor during our intimate moments grew distant. After a week apart, I was eager to reconnect, but she seemed uninterested, almost bored. I told myself it was just exhaustion from everything going on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. By the time I ran out of time off, Gary's condition had worsened, though he still had some good days left. Tracy would have to carry the load on her own for a while, and I accepted that I would be left alone for a month or more. Kaylee, our daughter, stepped in to help, which I was grateful for since Gary had been her godfather. She spent 2 weeks with us, lending a hand during the most difficult moments. A month later, Gary entered hospice care, and it was only a short time before he passed away. I flew out to California for the funeral, and Tracy was devastated. She was just as heartbroken as Gary's parents, and they repeatedly thanked us for everything we'd done. I deflected most of the thanks to Tracy, who had done the bulk of the caregiving. When Tracy came back home, she seemed distant and standoffish for the first week. I assumed it was just grief, but then something strange happened. For the next 3 weeks, we were incredibly intimate, almost as if a switch had flipped. We made love every day, and it felt like we were rediscovering each other. Despite everything that had happened, I found myself feeling more connected to her than I had in a long time. A month after we returned home, I was blindsided when Tracy came out of the bathroom holding a positive pregnancy test. In hindsight, I should have been more shocked by her calm reaction, but at the moment I could barely process what was happening. We were both 45, our kids were already in their 20s, and wait a second, wasn't she on the pill? Tracy explained almost casually that she'd forgotten to bring her birth control with us to California. Once she got out of the habit, she didn't think about it again. You know we've always been against pregnancy termination, she added, so we're going to handle this together. It's just you and me, Bobby. I was still trying to wrap my head around everything, but I found myself agreeing. The next thing I knew, I was going to be a father again. Holy crap. For the next week, I walked around in a daze, grinning like an idiot. To be honest, it didn't help that Tracy's intimacy drive was through the roof, like it had been with her previous pregnancies. And we were having love every night, sometimes twice. I couldn't keep up, but I certainly wasn't complaining. When our daughter Kaylee came home for a long weekend, she and Tracy went out for a shopping spree, picking up maternity and baby items. We had long since given away everything from the kids' earlier years. The two of them returned home laughing, and I ended up lugging in bags of baby clothes and other supplies. After putting together a quick dinner, Tracy started making jokes about how different maternity clothes were these days. She also mentioned that she didn't feel all that comfortable in the clothes she'd bought because they were made for women 10 to 20 years younger than her. Well, Mom, you can't help it if you're a MILF, and someone took that literally, Kaylee laughed. I noticed Tracy shoot Kaylee a quick frown, and I couldn't ignore the fact that Kaylee had said someone instead of Dad. It stuck with me. My stomach churned. It reminded me of the uneasy feelings I had when I went to California to help with Gary. I kept my mouth shut but stayed alert the rest of the weekend. More double-meaning comments came up, and I began to wonder if my daughter was subtly directing them at me or at Tracy. When Tracy stepped out of the room, I tried to find out by asking Kaylee how she felt about becoming a sister after all these years. Kaylee hesitated, looking anywhere but at me. After a long pause, she finally gave a nervous giggle, then tried to cover it up with a fake cough. I think it's great that Mom is so sexy and you're such a stud, she said before quickly leaving the room. I grabbed a couple of Rolaids, my new go-to. As Tracy's belly grew, she looked even more beautiful to me, though that nagging feeling of discomfort stayed. I couldn't put my finger on it, or maybe I just didn't want to. A few months later, I was at work when I got an unexpected call from Tracy, who had taken an unpaid leave after just 3 months back on the job. "Hey, babe, can you give me a lift to the hospital today?" she said, her voice sultry. I didn't understand at first. She was only about 6 months pregnant, so I wasn't expecting her to sound so calm. "Why the hospital?" I asked, my concern rising. "Is everything okay?" "Well, my water broke, and I'm too lazy to walk there," she replied casually. "Oh, crap!" I shouted, immediately running for my keys, rushing to tell my boss what was going on, and bolting to my car. I drove like a maniac, cutting the 15-minute trip down to 12 minutes. The whole time I couldn't shake the thought that Tracy was oddly nonchalant for someone who was only 6 months along. Premature births weren't good, and I was worried. When I got home, Tracy was calm, almost too calm for someone in labor. But then again, she'd done this before. Me? I was a wreck. 10 hours later, I became a father again to a beautiful baby girl. But something didn't feel right. A sick feeling started to rise in my stomach. After the nurse took the baby to clean her up, she handed her to me. But something inside me recoiled. The nurse looked at me, confused, when I instinctively pulled back. "This is a full-term baby, right?" I whispered to the doctor. He exchanged a look with Tracy, who was still being cleaned up by another nurse. Then I saw Tracy give the doctor a small shake of her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marsley," the doctor said, looking uncomfortable. "I can't discuss the baby's health with you. You're not on the privacy list. It's a HIPAA thing." "That was it," I snapped. "Screw HIPAA!" I yelled, making everyone in the room jump. "If that's my child, I have every right to know her health status. If she's not mine, you can't put my name on the birth certificate without my consent. And you damn well don't have it!" I pointed a finger at the doctor, my voice shaking with anger. "Get me a goddamn DNA test!" The silence in the room was deafening as I turned and walked out, quickly shedding my hospital gown as I went. For a moment, I caught sight of both our parents in the delivery room, but I didn't stop to say anything. I had nothing left to say. I ended up at the bar, knocking back shots number 6 and 7, and eating a greasy hamburger. By now, everyone who mattered had called to check in, except for the doctor with the DNA test results. I figured Tracy didn't want to drag anyone into the situation, since it was clear to her that this was already a done deal. Hell. I didn't expect it, but the combination of 7 shots and all the stress knocked me out cold that night. I didn't even feel the weight of what had happened until morning, when I woke up to a voicemail inbox that was completely full. The messages were all about Tracy and the baby, and the fact that I was supposed to bring them both home today. I was too hungover to process it. I took a shower, tried to shake off the fog in my head, and headed to the hospital, my stomach in knots. Tracy was breastfeeding the baby when I arrived. I sat in the chair next to her bed without saying a word, the weight of the situation hanging heavy between us. The baby was asleep, so Tracy gently placed her in the bassinet next to her. "I don't even know where to start, Bobby," Tracy said softly, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I went out there to help Gary, just to be a friend. But then he had a rough time, and one night, he broke down in my arms, and then it just happened. It was like the old times, you know? Once it started, it was so easy to keep going, even when you were here helping. And then when you left, it was like nothing could stop it. We kept sleeping together, sometimes for days on end. And then, I don't know how to explain it. It just felt like we were meant to be." She never looked up from the baby as she spoke, her words like a slow drip of poison. I let them sink in, but one part of her story hit me hard. "Wait, you were sleeping with Gary while Kaylee was visiting?" I asked, barely able to process it. Tracy blushed, her face turning an embarrassed shade of red. I wanted to punch a hole in the wall. "You let Kaylee know and never said a word to me?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Tell me you at least tried to stop her or bribed her somehow. This can't be real. Did Jeffrey know too? Does the whole damn world know I'm a loser?" Tracy's eyes widened and her tears started falling freely. She spoke slowly as if measuring her words. I knew Kaylee would understand. I never tried to hide it from her. I told her not to say anything, that it was on me, but she knew, she said, barely above a whisper. "No, Jeffrey doesn't know, and nobody else does. It's just you, me, and Kaylee. I want to keep it that way. We need to do what's right for Bobby Geraldine. She's not yours biologically, but she's yours now. We need to raise her the same way we raised Kaylee and Jeffrey. We're her parents now." "Bobby Geraldine? Really?" I muttered. "And what's her last name?" "Bobby Geraldine Martin," Tracy said. That's my last name too. But on the birth certificate, she's listed as Gary's daughter. No one except you and I need to see that. I just shook my head, struggling to hold back my anger. Why, Bobby? He was our best friend. He's gone now. I gave him comfort in his final days. What's so wrong with that? You make it sound so damn noble, I spat. But you were married to me. You crossed a line, Tracy. You didn't even ask me first. You broke your vows, betrayed my trust, and disrespected everything we promised to each other. Tracy's face hardened with frustration. No, you don't get it. It wasn't like that. I didn't do this on purpose. It wasn't just about lovemaking. It was about him being alone and needing someone. Doesn't matter, I said, my voice low. You never gave me the choice. You never asked me, Tracy. And I never agreed to raise a child that came from your affair. I won't do it. Tracy's voice wavered, but she still pleaded. But if Gary had died, and she was alone, you wouldn't think twice about raising her. No, I said, shaking my head. I wouldn't. But that's not what happened. I never agreed to raise his love child with you. Her voice cracked. I love you, Bobby. I don't want to lose you over this, mistake. Mistake? I repeated, my voice bitter. That's what you're calling it? You didn't just make a mistake, Tracy. You made a decision to go behind my back, to break everything we had. And now you want me to just accept it? You never even talked to me about it because you knew I'd never agree. You kept this secret from me, and now I'm supposed to raise another man's child. Tracy's eyes were filled with desperation. I didn't want this to happen, Bobby. I didn't know how to stop it once it started. Maybe you didn't, but you could have stopped once you realized what was at stake. You didn't. And now I'm supposed to pretend it didn't happen? I felt the fury build in me again. You think naming her Bobby Geraldine is supposed to make this better? That's just another slap in the face. Tracy sat silently for a moment before she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. I never meant to hurt you like this. I thought I was doing the right thing. I stared at her, the pain in my chest unbearable. You may have thought you were helping, but you were breaking us apart. The weekend after the baby was born, both Kaylee and Jeffrey came home from college to meet their new sibling. I was distant with Kaylee when she walked through the door, and she looked like she knew it. After a long hour of them fawning over the baby, Kaylee and I ended up cooking dinner together. She didn't make eye contact with me once during the whole process, and the silence between us was heavy. Jeffrey took care of the dishes after dinner, and then I grabbed Kaylee by the arm and pulled her outside to the back patio for a private conversation. We barely sat down before I let her have it. You knew she was cheating on me, and you didn't say a word, I hissed. Kaylee flinched at the venom in my voice, her eyes quickly filling with tears. She looked down, started to speak, but then finally met my pained gaze. At first, I was shocked, she began slowly, her voice trembling. But then I thought it was kind of brave. Mom was just trying to help Gary. I saw it as sad and loving and, I don't know, almost like something out of a tragedy. I never thought about her getting pregnant. I just assumed he was too sick for that, and I thought she was still on birth control. A compassionate friend or a cheating hoe? Those are my choices? I snapped, the words biting. Eat crap, Shakespeare, Kaylee cried harder as I ranted. What about the tragedy of my marriage, Kaylee? Did you even consider what this would do to me? The kids left for college Sunday afternoon, and the house went back to its oppressive silence. It felt like a tomb. Over the next few days, Tracy kept trying to get me to help with the baby, asking me to hold her for a few minutes or change her diaper. I refused every time, and Tracy's frustration grew with each attempt. You're acting like a damn 5-year-old, she yelled at me one night when I refused to hold the baby. Grow up. Put on your big boy pants. Tracy had probably never cursed at me like that in all our years together, but I wasn't fazed. I just stared at her blankly and walked out of the room without a word. Work became my escape. It was the only place I didn't have to think about the mess at home. When I was there, I was busy and occupied. When I was home, I was alone, my mind constantly circling back to the fact that Tracy had betrayed me. The baby wasn't at fault, but I couldn't look at her without seeing the image of Tracy and Gary together, and that thought made me sick. Divorce seemed like the only way out. One afternoon, I came home to find Tracy sitting at the kitchen table, a manila envelope spread out before her, papers scattered across the table. She was sniffling, wiping at her eyes. Guess I'll just order some pizza, I said quietly as I walked into the room. Pepperoni and breadsticks, okay? She shot me a venomous look. That's what matters to you? Dinner? She snapped. Don't you even care about us anymore? I sighed, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. I care, I said flatly, but not nearly as much as I did a few weeks ago. You don't see that you ruined everything when you betrayed me with our best friend. I don't even know who you are anymore. I paused for a moment before adding, if I were you, I'd get a lawyer and go tell Gary's parents they have a granddaughter. I'm sure they'd love to know. Tracy's face fell. You know I don't want a divorce. I love you. Please, think about this. Are you really better off alone? I let out another heavy sigh. I've thought about it more than you can imagine. This isn't about me, Tracy. It's about you breaking our vows, ripping my heart out. Tracy's voice softened, desperate. But Bobby, if you love me, can't you find it in your heart to forgive me? We can move past this. We belong together, you know it. I thought I knew that, I muttered, feeling the weight of it all. But this isn't something you can just apologize for and make it better. 24 years down the drain. My first call was to Jeffrey. I told him everything. Tracy's affair, the baby being Gary's, everything. He listened in silence, and then I heard him whisper, Screw. I told him I was filing for divorce. I'm glad you are, Dad. This is nonsense. What the hell was Mom thinking? He said, clearly angry. Are you okay? I'll be fine, I answered. I just want you to help look out for your sister. He hesitated for a moment, then corrected me. Half-sister, Dad, half-sister. I hadn't told my parents until the day after Tracy was served. My dad was livid, not just at Tracy, but at me too. He was furious that I had let her be alone with Gary for so long. You knew they had a thing for each other for years. How could you be so naive? He scolded. You trusted her completely, but you should know by now. You can't trust other men with your woman. Not when you're not around. I had to admit, my dad had a point. Looking back, I should have fought harder to stop Tracy from being alone with Gary. That was something I could have controlled. But my mom saw things differently. She thought I was in the wrong for walking out on Tracy without giving her a chance to make things right. To her, I was giving up too easily. Everyone makes mistakes, she said. She didn't believe what Tracy did was unforgivable. According to her, everyone deserves another shot, especially if love is still there. She also insisted that I was responsible for helping raise the baby, no matter the circumstances, and to her the child was still her grandchild. She made sure to call me by my full name, something she only did when she was serious, basically signaling she was on Tracy's side. Dad, on the other hand, just stared at the ceiling, knowing this conversation wasn't going to end well. I didn't call Kaylee right away. I assumed Tracy would have reached out to her first after the divorce papers were filed, and sure enough, she did. Kaylee called me later that day, fired up and demanding that I stop holding on to my anger over what happened. She told me to move past it, that Tracy was still my wife, and that we should figure out how to raise the baby together. But my frustration had been building for so long that I couldn't take her advice seriously. I reminded her that she hadn't even told me about her mother's affair in the first place, which made me feel like she had no right to lecture me on moving forward. Meanwhile, I heard that Gary's parents were shocked, but happy to learn they had a granddaughter. They were upset that Tracy had kept it secret, but they understood her reasons. The next day, they called me, pleading with me to stay with Tracy and raise Gary's child. They said we had been close for years, and they thought I would be the best person to raise their granddaughter. I didn't sugarcoat my feelings when I told them I couldn't do it. I was too angry at both Gary and Tracy to even consider it. I also heard from my in-laws who pushed me to stay with Tracy. They acknowledged what she did was wrong, but said she still loved me and that we could make it work. They thought raising the child together could help heal things. I told them I wasn't sure if I could get past what she had done, no matter how much she might love me now. Tracy fought the divorce, of course. She and her lawyer arranged 12 counseling sessions, and while I had no choice but to attend, I wasn't going to be easily swayed. The first session was with Dr. Jocelyn McAdams. She was in her 40s, professional and calm, dressed in a gray blazer and skirt. When I walked in, Tracy was already seated, and the doctor gave me a firm handshake. Dr. McAdams let Tracy go first and tell her version of things, which I already knew. I didn't even pay much attention as she spoke, since I had heard it all before. I figured when it was my turn, I'd get a chance to say my piece, but when she turned to me, it was like I was in the hot seat. She told me I had the power in the situation, that I could save my marriage and keep my family together by putting my ego aside. I was shocked by her words, especially coming from a professional. It felt like everyone was trying to tell me to just forgive and move on, to let go of my anger. She said I could still make things work with Tracy if I was willing to let go of my pride and forgive her. I wasn't having it. I stood up, turned to leave, and called my lawyer. I told him I wasn't going to continue seeing this counselor unless they found someone who could stay neutral. The second counselor, Dr. Lauren Avent, at least listened to both sides. But even then, I could tell I was still being pushed into a corner. Dr. Avent asked me what it would take to fix things, suggesting that love was enough to rebuild the marriage, especially with the baby involved. But I wasn't interested in her perspective. I told her straight out that I wasn't going to raise another man's child. That was not something I was willing to do, no matter the circumstances. Dr. Avent seemed to think it was all about my ego. I shot back, disgusted by her attitude, telling her that the real issue was that Tracy had betrayed me. I hadn't cheated, I hadn't broken any vows. She was the one who had crossed that line, and now I had to figure out how to live with the consequences. I wasn't about to be the one to take the blame for what happened. I made it clear that Tracy was the one who needed to explain her actions and deal with the mess she created. Despite what everyone else might say, I couldn't just move on. It wasn't that simple. I caught a glimpse of Tracy's face, and it was clear she wasn't happy. The counselor, Dr. Avent, was trying her best to remain neutral, but I could tell she was focused on guiding the conversation in a specific direction. I didn't expect the turn the session was about to take. Dr. Avent posed a question that caught me off guard. She asked if I would consider raising another man's child if I remarried someone with kids. I could feel her eyes on me as she waited for my response. I answered, acknowledging that yes, technically, I would be raising another man's child. But the key difference here was that Tracy's child was conceived during our marriage, not after a divorce. That made it a whole different situation in my opinion. Dr. Avent gave a slight nod, but didn't seem satisfied. She pressed on, asking if I wasn't just splitting hairs, pointing out that Gary, the biological father, had died before the child was even born. I responded sharply, explaining that it wasn't about the timeline of Gary's death. The real issue was that Tracy had been dishonest. She didn't come clean until I caught her, and that hurt more than anything. Dr. Avent seemed ready to continue, but I cut her off. I told her it wasn't just about love anymore. Yes, I still loved Tracy, but how could she claim to love me when she had cheated, gotten pregnant by another man, and then tried to pass off the baby as mine? That wasn't a mistake. It was a series of conscious choices she made. The fact that she tried to justify it as an act of compassion, considering Gary was dying, only made it worse. If it had been so compassionate, why didn't she come to me, her husband, and discuss it first? I would have said no. She knew I would. The bottom line was that once we made our vows, we were no longer just individuals. We were a unit, and that meant we had to make decisions together. Tracy's actions had violated that commitment, and she never gave me the chance to have a say in something that should have affected both of us. Dr. Avent seemed to be struggling to maintain her neutral stance. After a long pause, she asked if there was enough love left for me to step up and be both a husband and a father. She suggested that since Gary was no longer around, there was no reason to keep punishing Tracy and that I should try to move forward. I shot back, frustrated. I didn't appreciate the guilt trip. Tracy and Gary had shattered my heart, and there was no easy way to fix that. I told her that my love for Tracy was fading quickly, and as for the baby, while I felt bad for her, it wasn't my responsibility. I didn't see any chance of saving the marriage. I had tried, but Tracy's betrayal was too much. After that, we had a second session, and I barely spoke. I was done with the counseling. Tracy, on the other hand, cried and tried to convince me to reconsider. She had no intention of letting go without a fight. The counselor finally acknowledged the impasse, telling me she would inform the judge that the sessions hadn't made any progress. I said nothing, except to thank her. 6 months later, just before Christmas, the divorce was finalized. Since we lived in a no-fault state, everything was split evenly. But Tracy ended up buying me out of my half of the house. It made sense. She had the baby to take care of, and Gary had left her enough money for the house. She also received alimony, given that I earned more than she did. Although my son had stuck by me through the whole ordeal, I knew he still wanted to spend Christmas with his mom, sister, and half-sister. I told him I was fine with it, and that we'd celebrate New Year's together instead. A couple of days before Christmas, I dropped by the old house to deliver presents. I didn't have much for Tracy or the baby, but I didn't want to look petty. I wasn't there for anything other than to show I still cared enough to do what was expected. Tracy was surprised when she answered the door with the baby in her arms. I could tell she wasn't sure what to make of the situation when she saw the bags of gifts I was holding. She hesitated before letting me in. We walked into the living room, which still had the Christmas tree up, decorated just like it always had been when we were together. But now, I could see how different everything felt. I hadn't done any of the decorating this year. It was all on her. I stood there, staring at the decorations, fighting back the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. It hurt to see everything the way it was, but also to know it wasn't mine to share anymore. Tracy, trying to lighten the mood, suggested I have some eggnog while she put the presents under the tree. She asked me to hold the baby for a minute. As much as I wanted to refuse, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I took the baby from her, keeping her at arm's length, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. For a moment, I just stood there, feeling awkward. But then, I adjusted her into my arms, like I used to hold my own kids when they were small. It wasn't easy, but I managed. Tracy returned with the eggnog, and seeing the baby cradled in my arms, she smiled. She said it brought back memories of how I used to take care of our kids when they were little. Her voice softened as she added that not every man had a natural touch with babies, like I did. It was almost like she was trying to remind me of the good times, but it only made things worse. How could I ever forget the way everything had fallen apart? How could I reconcile this version of our life with what had actually happened? I forced a smile, though it felt strained. The baby was undeniably beautiful, with her mother's striking features, but I couldn't bring myself to feel fully comfortable around her. The circumstances were too much to ignore. The question haunted me. If you can't forget, can you ever truly forgive? I didn't think so, though I knew many people, especially my family, would argue otherwise. After some awkward small talk, Tracy began unpacking the 2 bags of presents I'd brought. When she reached the first package addressed to Bobby Geraldine, she paused, her face tightening. A tear slid down her cheek as she looked up at me. "You didn't have to get her something, Bobby," she said, her voice wavering. I shrugged lightly. "Christmas is for all kids, Tracy. I couldn't leave your little one out." I glanced down at the baby in my arms, feeling a pang in my chest. In a different world, one where things had gone differently, she could have been my daughter. But she wasn't, and I struggled to push down the lump in my throat. I couldn't hate her, not really, but I hated the way she had come into this world, the way her mother had betrayed me. It wasn't lost on me that Tracy had handed me the baby to hold, a silent reminder of what had been lost. As Tracy continued unwrapping the gifts, she came to the first package with her name on it. She looked at it in disbelief, then looked up at me, her voice breaking. "Oh, Bobby, really? You shouldn't have. I wasn't expecting anything. I didn't get you anything. I'm sorry." I shook my head. "It's fine, Tracy. I just want you all to have a great Christmas." She wiped her eyes, then hesitated before speaking again. "You know, you could come over tomorrow. You're more than welcome. We'll have plenty of food, and I know the kids would love it." I shook my head gently, not wanting to hurt her feelings, but knowing I couldn't do it. "Not this time, Trace. Maybe next year, but it's just too soon. Too much, you know?" My heart's still raw. She dropped her eyes to the floor, her shoulders slumping. I wasn't being cruel. I was just being honest. The wound was still too fresh, and I wasn't ready to pretend everything was okay. Christmas Eve found me at a Barnes & Noble, browsing through a new Clive Cussler novel while sipping on a peppermint mocha latte from the Starbucks inside. The place was quiet, and I looked around to see 2 other guys equally lost in their books. We didn't leave until they were practically kicking us out. I didn't have anywhere else to be, and I wasn't in a rush to go home to the empty apartment. When I finally did go back, I wasn't exactly excited. I'd picked up some chicken salad the day before, and I toasted some bread to eat with it. A bag of Ruffles chips and a glass of Don Julio tequila made for the most unremarkable Christmas Eve dinner. But I was alone, and at least the tequila helped dull the loneliness. I woke up with a slight hangover the next morning, Christmas Day. 4 aspirin, a couple of Pop-Tarts, and 3 cups of coffee later, I was functional, if not exactly in the holiday spirit. I hadn't planned anything for the day, so I went over to my parents' house. The 3 of us spent the afternoon together, eating my mom's baked ham and exchanging a few small gifts. My kids had dropped off presents for me when they found out I'd be spending the holiday with my parents. We ended the day sipping hot chocolate with peppermint schnapps as an after-dinner drink, and I couldn't help but think back to the Christmases we used to have as a family. I had to admit that, in some way, I still loved Tracy. But there were lingering doubts. Had I made the right decision? Would I ever be able to forgive her? I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if I could. Was leaving her the right move, or had I overreacted? Apparently, I wasn't the only one reflecting on the past. "Bobby," my mom said, breaking the silence. "Dad and I consider Bobby Geraldine our granddaughter. We got her gifts for Christmas." I looked up at her, a mix of surprise and confusion in my eyes. "She'll never know, Gary. He's gone. But she will accept a good man as her father," my mom continued. "I'm not saying we agree with what Tracy did, but we understand her choices in a way. And we still love her." My mom's voice broke a little. She wiped her eyes, trying to steady herself. "Bobby, you could be that good man. You should be. I think you want to, but you're afraid. You're worried what people will think if you take her back, if you raise the baby as your own. But you're still the same man you were before all this. Don't let your pride keep you from doing the right thing." I could feel the weight of her words, but I also knew that nothing would change my mind. I couldn't forgive what Tracy had done. She had betrayed me, lied to me, and gone behind my back. I could never look at that baby without seeing the consequences of her actions. A year later, I hadn't really moved on. My routine was simple. I worked, I came home to my quiet apartment, and I lived a life of solitude. I hadn't dated, and most of my friends had drifted away. Tracy, on the other hand, seemed to have a support system that remained intact, but I wasn't surprised. She had a lot of friends, and I had learned the hard way that most of our friends were really just hers. It stung more than I let on when I heard that Tracy had been telling everyone I abandoned her after the baby was born, conveniently leaving out the part where the baby wasn't mine. It wasn't entirely unexpected, but it still hurt. One evening I was at a local bar when Carl and Susie Dimmick walked in and sat down at a table. They were a couple I had always considered friends, but when I approached them to say hello, I was met with a frosty reception. Susie's look was nothing short of a sneer, and Carl barely managed a polite nod. I was angry. What had I done to deserve this? And I wasn't going to let it slide. "What the hell did I do to you two?" I demanded. Susie's response was sharp. "Not to us, to Tracy. How could you just walk away from her after everything she's been through? She had a child late in life, Bobby. How could you leave her like that?" I felt a surge of frustration. "Is that really what this is about?" I asked, incredulous. "How about you hear the whole story before you judge?" I stood in front of Carl and Susie, too angry to sit. Leaning in close, I kept my voice low but harsh. "So nobody bothered to tell you that the kid you're talking about isn't mine?" I snapped. "She got pregnant by her ex while we were still married. He died from cancer before the baby was even born, and Tracy tried to make me believe it was mine. 24 years together, and this is the loyalty I get? I didn't abandon her, she abandoned me. So no, screw her, screw both of you, and screw everything you stand for." I turned and walked away, leaving them stunned. My second Christmas as a divorcee started the same as the first, alone. I ended up at Barnes & Noble, again. The Christmas Eve Losers Club had expanded from 3 to 4 this year. I took a quick mental inventory of the women sitting nearby. One had curly red hair, the other, well, she was stunning. Asian, with long black hair and curves tucked under a sweatshirt. She looked to be in her early 50s, but could have passed for younger. I couldn't help but stare for a minute before deciding to go for it. Worst case, she says no. I grabbed my book and latte, walked over, and she glanced up as I approached. "I don't think I've seen you here last year," I said. "You're new to the Christmas Eve Losers Club. I'm Bobby, the president. What brings a beautiful woman out on a night like this?" She laughed, and it was the first real sound of joy I'd heard in days. Encouraged, I kept going. "I know this sounds crazy, but I actually have a second Hungry Man dinner in my freezer if you're not busy. I know we've just met, but..." I gave her my best puppy dog look. "Well, I don't usually do things like this," she said with a smile. "But since you're the president, and you're talking about Hungry Man dinners, I'll accept. I'm Angel Wong." We exchanged information, and I told her to meet me at 6. At 6 on the dot, Angel showed up. We weren't exactly normal, but that was fine. Dinner at my kitchen table, a bottle of Burgundy, and some much-needed conversation followed. I told her my story, and she shared hers. Angel was 5 years older than me and had been divorced for 10 years after leaving an abusive marriage. Her ex-husband, who had been physically and verbally abusive, had put her in the hospital with a broken jaw. She was a small woman, barely 5'1", and he wasn't much bigger. His offense had started verbally and escalated over the years. Despite everything, she had struggled to leave, believing it was somehow her fault. It took a counselor to help her see that she wasn't to blame. Eventually, after another fight, she knew she had to get out for her own safety. Her ex ended up in prison for battery and disappeared from her life completely. There were no kids and her life was quieter now, though she admitted Christmas was always the hardest time of year for her. "I know it sounds crazy," she said, holding back tears, "but I just didn't want to be alone. And how could I turn down a hungry man dinner?" As we talked, I realized how much worse things could have been for me. Angel's story made mine seem less painful in comparison. We spent the rest of the evening on the couch watching Christmas movies. We started with the Mr. Magoo version of A Christmas Carol, and I could tell she was my kind of person when she agreed with me that Magoo was the best Scrooge. We watched The Grinch and It's a Wonderful Life. By the time the latter rolled around, Angel had fallen asleep. She looked peaceful, smiling, so I covered her with a quilt, climbed under it myself, and settled in. I must have dozed off, but when I woke up, things were different. Somehow, we were lying down now, her head resting on my chest, her body half on top of mine. My arm was around her, holding her close, and my hand had somehow found its way into her back pocket. The TV was showing snowflakes. I lay there, holding Angel as she slept for another 20 minutes, and it felt surprisingly right. When she finally stirred and opened her eyes, there was confusion in her gaze. I smiled, kissed her gently on the nose, and she scrunched it up in that adorable way of hers before giving me a warm, radiant smile. It was the first time in a while that I felt genuinely at peace. The silence between us lingered for a few moments, then Angel shyly asked if it was morning. I responded, pulling her closer and whispering, "Merry Christmas." We stayed like that for a while, smiling and content, before she broke the quiet again, her cheeks turning pink as she admitted that she had never done anything like this before. She asked if I felt the same connection, and I couldn't help but grin, telling her I definitely did. She moved a little closer, our lips meeting softly at first, then with more urgency. We kissed several more times before the rest of our clothes were discarded. I was surprised by how tight she was. It was more than I'd expected. As the moment passed, I couldn't help but think how crazy it was that, after just meeting her, everything felt so right. Angel seemed to be thinking the same thing, as I caught her looking at me the same way. I suggested that she didn't have any plans for the day, and if she was free, I had everything I needed for a Christmas dinner. If I was going to go to all the trouble of cooking, it seemed only right to have someone beautiful sitting across from me at the table. Her smile lit up my chest. She told me she needed a shower and had nothing to change into, but she could run home for a bit and come back. I grinned, offering her the idea of sharing my shower, and said I was sure I could find a shirt that would fit her. She agreed, and soon we were in the kitchen, where I poured us both a glass of Riesling while I began prepping the meal. Angel asked if I had any family plans, and I told her the truth. I'd been invited to my ex-wife's family dinner, but I'd turned it down. I explained how it was all a setup, with my ex hoping I'd come back to her. She wanted me to hold her daughter, be surrounded by the families, and pretend everything was fine. But I refused. I wasn't going to walk back into that mess. Angel listened, and after I finished, I suggested we talk about something more real, about us. We shared a smile and kissed again. Just then, I heard the key turn in the door. Jeffrey, my son, walked in, calling out before he noticed us. When he did, his eyes widened, and we froze mid-kiss. He quickly turned away, clearly embarrassed. He told us that his mom had sent him to drag me back for Christmas dinner. She assumed I'd be alone, but he realized I wasn't. When he apologized for interrupting, I assured him he wasn't interrupting anything except my dinner prep. Jeffrey, still somewhat awkward, finally turned around to meet Angel. She too seemed a little shy, but handled the situation well. I could tell Jeffrey was trying to be polite, though he couldn't help but glance at her. After the introductions, I quickly changed the topic, asking about the gifts I'd sent for the family. Jeffrey told me that everyone loved them, especially Bobby G, the baby. He mentioned how much stuff she had under the tree with all the grandparents around. It was a small victory in a year full of uncertainty. Jeffrey stayed only for a short while, saying goodbye before heading out. I hugged him tightly, and before he left, I joked about seeing him on New Year's, promising that Angel would have more clothes on next time. He blushed but nodded, saying he'd see me then. Once he was gone, I turned to Angel, who raised an eyebrow at me. She asked if the whole thing was too awkward and questioned why I was already thinking about New Year's. I teased her, saying that, as my fiancé, she had to be with me on that night. She laughed and joked about me being too sure of myself, but I responded that I'd be even more sure when she picked out her ring the next morning. I wasn't about to hide it. I knew exactly what I wanted, and I was sure she did too. Angel then asked if she could go home first to get some clothes, to which I half-jokingly pretended to be disappointed, but I agreed. The day was still young, and we had our own plans to make. The morning after Angel chose a 1-carat marquise-cut diamond engagement ring, we had lunch together and I shared the news with my son and then my parents. My son was genuinely happy for me, but my parents were less than thrilled. They still seemed to hold out hope that I would reconcile with Tracy and raise her child as my own. My mother questioned if this was all just to spite Tracy, suggesting that Tracy still loved me. I responded bluntly, pointing out that if she truly cared, her actions would reflect that. I didn't bother telling my daughter about the engagement yet. Though our relationship had improved somewhat, she was still loyal to her mother, believing Tracy's actions were about love and sacrifice. I knew she'd eventually find out, and likely try to convince me to reconsider my decision. It was hard to explain how Angel and I clicked so quickly, especially after being with Tracy for more than 25 years. The connection with Angel was deep and immediate, something I never expected, and it felt as though we had known each other forever. Despite my skepticism about love at first sight, everything about our relationship seemed right. Angel wasn't young either, and we both found it baffling how quickly we had fallen for each other. We had questioned things at first, but then realized it was best to let everything happen naturally. After a month, Angel moved in with me, and from then on, it felt like we were inseparable. My parents, while still holding on to the idea of me reuniting with Tracy, seemed to accept Angel, though my daughter Kaylee clearly didn't. She still hoped for my reconciliation with her mother. 6 months later, we planned a small wedding. I invited both my kids and my parents, while Angel invited a cousin and a few close friends with their families. We held the celebration at one of my favorite restaurants in a private party room. The day went smoothly, but Kaylee cornered me at one point, questioning why Tracy and her family weren't invited. I calmly explained that inviting my ex would have been disrespectful to Angel and reminded her that we weren't friends anymore, so it was out of the question. Angel and Tracy didn't meet in person until 2 years later at Kaylee's wedding. Tracy organized the entire event, and I happily funded everything. Angel, ever graceful and classy, stayed in the background, letting Tracy take the spotlight. Aside from paying for the wedding, my only role was walking Kaylee down the aisle. As I did, I couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and nostalgia. I recalled memories of the years I'd spent with Tracy, raising Kaylee and sharing family moments. Not everything had been bad between us, and we had shared 24 good years. Angel, sensing my emotional reflection, slipped her arm around me, offering silent support. She stayed out of the way, only interacting with Tracy when necessary, understanding that it was the right thing to do. Tracy, however, looked furious every time she glanced at Angel, and I later learned that Tracy, along with all 6 grandparents, believed Angel was somehow trying to take Tracy's place, thinking our marriage was just a fleeting phase. Despite the tension, Angel and I's marriage has endured. We recently celebrated our 25th anniversary with a quiet dinner and a peaceful evening together. While our intimacy wasn't as wild as it had been in our younger years, we cherished the calm and the connection we shared. We fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, content. Looking back, I don't have much to complain about. I had a fulfilling first marriage for 24 years, and now, with Angel, I've had another 25 years of happiness. My children are happily married with 3 wonderful grandchildren. As for Tracy, she never remarried. From what my kids have shared, it seems not many men were interested in a middle-aged woman with a young child, despite her looks. My children speculate that she had a few brief relationships, but they often joke that she might have snapped without them. Though Tracy never remarried, she stayed in touch with the kids and they kept a relationship with their half-sister. The 3 sets of grandparents also made sure to give the child all their love until they passed away. My son, the only one who kept regular contact with me after the divorce, mentioned that Tracy didn't date for the first 5 years after I remarried, still hoping my second marriage wouldn't last. I'm sure Angel was glad to prove her wrong.